The Viridian 7 luxury coastal resort existed as a monument to the galaxy's collective triumph over nature, which was to say, it represented everything that could go spectacularly wrong when several dozen species decided that comfort equaled superiority. The resort's promotional materials bragged about its perfectly calibrated atmospheric processes and guaranteed meteorological stability, which should have been everyone's first clue that disaster was lurking just beyond the horizon, probably checking its watch and grinning. The beach stretched for kilometers along crystalline waters, dotted with species-appropriate relaxation pods. The Korathi floated in their saline suspension chambers. The Venturian cliff-dwellers occupied vertical perches that jutted from artificial rock formations, and the Thessian contingent had essentially encased themselves in temperature-regulated bubbles that filtered out 98% of sensory input, because apparently the entire point of their vacation was to experience as little as possible. Various other species lounged, hovered, or photosynthesized according to their biological requirements, all unified in their absolute certainty that the universe bent to their technological will. The resort management, a collection of fastidiously organized Prelian administrators who treated weather patterns like subordinates that could be fired for insubordination, monitored their atmospheric displays with the confidence of people who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by filing it in triplicate. Their weather prediction algorithms had been purchased from the Tessic Consortium for an amount of credits that could have funded a small planetary defense grid, which in retrospect might have been the better investment. Then the rain arrived, and with it, the kind of chaos that made excellent comedy for anyone not directly involved. The atmospheric processes wheezed, sparked, and died with the dramatic timing of an opera singer hitting the wrong note. The Prelian resort director stared at his readouts as they transformed from reassuring green to accusatory red, and somewhere in his triple-chambered brain, he experienced what humans would call an existential crisis, but what his species termed critical operational parameter deviation awareness. The first drops hit a Venturian diplomat, who shrieked as though the water itself was personally offended by his existence. A Korathi administrator immediately began composing a formal complaint, because when your species has been spacefaring for 12,000 years, your first instinct in any crisis is proper documentation. The Thessians increased their bubble opacity to maximum, which essentially meant they were spending extraordinary amounts of energy to remain completely oblivious, a survival strategy that explained much about their foreign policy. Water poured from the sky with the enthusiasm of an element that had been held back too long and was now making up for lost time. Within minutes, the beach transformed from a picture of controlled leisure into something resembling a refugee camp designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything. Aliens scrambled for their various technological solutions, all of which had been designed for every possible scenario except the one currently happening. The Venturians deployed emergency shelter domes that promptly filled with water because nobody had considered that holes for ventilation might also admit rain. The Korathi attempted to recalibrate their suspension chambers, which resulted in several of them being ejected onto the beach like disgruntled fish. One Thessian's bubble shorted out entirely, forcing him to actually experience weather for the first time in his adult life, an event he would later describe in testimony as catastrophically unregulated atmospheric moisture bombardment. Amid this orchestrated pandemonium, 5 humans sat on a beach blanket, watching the proceedings with the detached amusement of people who had seen this exact scenario play out on at least 4 continents back home. "Should we help?" asked Marcus Chen, the expedition's engineer, though his tone suggested he was already mentally cataloging available resources. "Give it another minute," replied Keiko Tanaka, their xenobiologist, who was timing something on her waterproof chronometer. I want to see if anyone tries to negotiate with the rain. The Prelian director is filing a formal protest with the planetary weather system, observed James Okonkwo, their cultural liaison, who had exceptional hearing and a gift for deadpan delivery. Outstanding, said Yuki Matsuda, their pilot, grinning as she watched a Venturian attempt to intimidate a rain cloud through aggressive posturing. The fifth human, Diego Reyes, their survival specialist, was already standing, his vacation mentality transitioning to operational mode with the smooth efficiency of someone who had spent years being disappointed by supposedly reliable equipment. All right, looks like we're doing this, Chen. I need you on structural assessment. Tanaka, catalog what's edible. Okonkwo, start managing expectations. Matsuda, help me gather materials. Are we seriously building shelters on an alien resort planet? Matsuda asked, though she was already moving. Would you prefer to watch 300 highly advanced life forms drown in 8 centimeters of water? Reyes replied. Fair point. The humans moved through the chaos with purpose, largely ignored by aliens who were too busy experiencing technological failure to notice that 5 primitives, from a planet that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 30 years ago, were calmly assessing the situation like it was a minor inconvenience rather than a civilization-ending catastrophe. Reyes and Matsuda began harvesting palm fronds from the ornamental trees that lined the beach, vegetation that had been imported at tremendous expense purely for aesthetic purposes. The resort designers had never considered that the plants might have practical applications, because practicality was what you worried about before you achieved post-scarcity economics and artificial gravity. Chen surveyed the beach structure, identifying the most stable locations for temporary shelters while mentally calculating load distributions and drainage patterns, his engineering brain unable to shut off even when technically on vacation. Tanaka began examining the resort's decorative fruit displays, separating actual food from the alarming number of toxic to most species ornamental specimens that some designer had thought looked exotic. Okonkwo positioned himself strategically and began what would later be described in official reports as preliminary diplomatic outreach, but which actually consisted of him shouting, "Hey, anyone who wants to not be soaking wet should probably come over here." A Korathi administrator, designated Velkoth, but thinking of himself as senior regulatory compliance officer, 3rd class, squelched across the sand toward the humans, his aquatic biology making him slightly less miserable than most, but his bureaucratic nature making him substantially more annoyed. "What precisely are you doing?" Velkoth demanded, watching Matsuda weave palm fronds with practiced efficiency. "Building a roof," Matsuda replied, not looking up from her work. "That is plant matter." "Correct. You are using plant matter as construction material. Your observational skills are remarkable. This is highly irregular. There are proper protocols for emergency shelter deployment. And how are those protocols working out?" Matsuda asked, gesturing at the beach, where a Venturian emergency shelter had just collapsed into a soggy heap. Velkoth's communication membranes rippled with what might have been uncertainty or possibly indigestion. "The theoretical framework is sound. Shame about the practical application," Matsuda said, securing another layer of fronds. Within 20 minutes, the humans had constructed 3 large lean-to structures using palm fronds, driftwood, and a philosophical approach to engineering that prioritized good enough over perfect. The shelters were not architectural marvels. They would not win design awards. They looked like exactly what they were: emergency constructions made from available materials by people who understood that sometimes the best solution was the one that actually worked. The rain continued its assault. More alien technology failed in increasingly creative ways. The Thessian climate control unit exploded with a pop that sounded almost apologetic. The Venturians had formed a committee to discuss optimal shelter strategies, which meant they were still standing in the rain arguing about theoretical approaches while getting progressively wetter. "Shelters ready," Reyes called out, his voice cutting through the storm. "Anyone interested in being dry can come over." The response was not immediate. Several species continued attempting their own solutions, unwilling to accept that creatures who still used chemical propulsion for atmospheric flight might have something useful to offer. But cold, wet, and miserable tends to erode prejudice faster than diplomatic summits, and gradually aliens began migrating toward the human shelters, with the reluctant shuffle of people accepting that their pride was worth less than their comfort. A Venturian diplomat, her crest feathers plastered against her skull in a deeply undignified manner, ducked under the palm roof and stared upward at the woven fronds. "This is remarkably crude." "Yeah, but you're not getting rained on anymore," Chen pointed out. The Venturian considered this, water dripping from her beak. "I concede your point." More aliens crowded under the shelters, a bizarre collection of galactic citizens united by their shared dampness and grudging appreciation. The Kurathi officials huddled together, occasionally making notes for their inevitable reports. Several Thessians, their bubbles abandoned, experienced unfiltered reality with expressions suggesting this might be character building, but they would prefer it stopped immediately. "Now comes the interesting part," Reyes said, surveying the crowd of miserable aliens. He turned to Okonkwo. "Start gathering dry wood. Anything that's not too wet, check under the pavilion overhangs." "Are we doing what I think we're doing?" Okonkwo asked. "If you're thinking we're going to introduce our new friends to fire, then yes. The galaxy is not ready for this conversation. Probably not, but I'm cold and hungry, so they're getting it anyway." The humans dispersed again, collecting materials while their alien shelter mates watched with varying degrees of confusion and concern. Matsuda returned with an armload of decorative wooden serving trays, several broken furniture pieces, and what appeared to be part of a ceremonial Prelian administrative desk. "Is that stolen?" asked a Kurathi junior analyst. "It's repurposed," Matsuda corrected. "There's a difference, mainly paperwork." Reyes constructed a fire pit with stones from the decorative garden borders, arranging them in a configuration that would contain the flames while allowing airflow, his hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who had built hundreds of campfires across dozens of environments. He arranged the wood in a careful structure, smallest pieces at the center, larger ones angled to catch and sustain the burn. Then he pulled out a small plasma torch from his emergency kit, because humans might embrace primitive techniques, but they weren't stupid about it, and ignited the kindling. The reaction was immediate and diverse. The Venturians shrieked and retreated to the far edge of the shelter. The Kurathi began an emergency consensus protocol to determine appropriate response procedures. The Thessians, who had never actually seen combustion outside of controlled industrial settings, stared at the flames with the horrified fascination of people watching someone juggle live grenades. "That is uncontrolled oxidation," Velkoth announced, his voice hitting frequencies that suggested deep concern. "That is a campfire," Chen corrected. "Very controlled oxidation. Humans invented this roughly 400,000 years ago. We've had time to work out the safety issues. It is consuming matter and releasing energy in an unregulated exothermic reaction. Yes, that's how fire works. Congratulations on your scientific literacy. This violates at minimum 47 resort safety protocols. So did the entire atmospheric processing system, but you don't hear us complaining," Matsuda said, warming her hands near the flames. The fire crackled cheerfully, utterly indifferent to the diplomatic incident it was causing. Heat radiated outward, and despite their concerns, the aliens began edging closer, drawn by warmth the way any biological organism is drawn to energy gradients that favor survival. Tanaka returned with an impressive collection of food items, her analysis having separated the safe from the potentially lethal, with the efficiency of someone who had studied xenobiology specifically to avoid accidentally poisoning people. Good news. About 60% of the buffet items are compatible with human biochemistry, and I'm reasonably certain they won't kill anyone else either. Reasonably certain? Asked Athesian, his voice small. Science is about acceptable margins of error, Tanaka replied cheerfully. The humans began cooking, which introduced an entirely new layer of confusion to the proceedings. They skewered various food items on cleaned branches, held them over the flames, and transformed raw ingredients into something hot, fragrant, and fundamentally different from its original state. You are using thermal energy to alter the molecular structure of organic nutrients, Velkoth said, watching with the transfixed horror of someone witnessing culinary heresy. We call it cooking, Okonkwo said, turning a skewer of vegetables that were beginning to char pleasantly at the edges. You should try it. Transforms the flavor profile, breaks down complex proteins, makes certain nutrients more bioavailable. Also, it tastes good, which is really the main point. We have molecular reconstruction technology that can transform any base matter into nutritionally optimal food substances with perfect flavor balancing, a Venturian noted. And how's that working out for you right now? Okonkwo asked, gesturing at the dark resort where all power systems had failed. The Venturian had no response to this, mainly because she was staring at the cooking food with an expression suggesting her stomach was having opinions her brain hadn't authorized. The humans continued their work, seasoning food with supplies from their personal kits, creating combinations that filled the shelter with smells that transcended species barriers. The fundamental appeal of cooked food, it turned out, was fairly universal among carbon-based life forms with chemoreceptive capabilities. Would you like some? Matsuda offered, holding out a skewer to Velkoth. The Korathi official stared at the offered food like it might be a trap, possibly because in his experience, nothing was ever given freely without proper documentation. What is it? Grilled vegetables with a light herb seasoning. Compatible with Korathi biochemistry, according to our xenobiologist, who has multiple advanced degrees and a generally excellent track record of not poisoning people. The generally is not inspiring confidence, Velkoth said, but he took the skewer anyway because he was hungry and wet, and the food smelled extraordinary. He took a cautious bite. His chemoreceptive membranes flared in surprise. This is remarkably pleasant. Yeah, fire is pretty great once you get over the whole uncontrolled oxidation thing, Matsuda said. More aliens accepted food, their initial reluctance dissolving faster than their dignity in the rain. The Venturian diplomat discovered that grilled fruit had a complexity her molecular reconstruction technology had never achieved. Athesian experienced actual flavor for possibly the first time in years, his sensory filters abandoned along with his protective bubble. Even the Korathi officials, who prided themselves on their analytical approach to nutrition, found themselves going back for seconds. The humans moved through the crowd, distributing food, adjusting the fire, making sure everyone was warm and fed with the unconscious hospitality of a species that had refined the art of communal eating over millennia of evolution. They shared stories, explained techniques, answered questions about human culture with the patience of people who genuinely enjoyed cross-species interaction. "Why do you know how to do this?" asked a young Thessian, watching Reyes expertly manage the fire to maintain consistent heat. "Your species has advanced technology. You have molecular fabricators, automated climate systems, portable fusion generators." "Yeah, and all that stuff breaks," Reyes said, poking the fire to redistribute the coals. "This doesn't. Well, it can go out, but then you just light it again. Technology is great right up until it fails, and then you need to know how to function without it. Your species plans for technological failure. Our species assumes technological failure," Chen interjected. "We have a saying, hope for the best, plan for the worst. Mostly we get something in between, which is where the actual skill comes in." "This seems inefficient," the Thessian said, though he was huddled close to the fire and eating his third helping of grilled vegetables. "Maybe," Okonkwo said, "but we're warm, dry, and fed, which is more than anyone else on this beach can say right now." The storm continued outside, rain hammering against the palm frond roofs that held steady despite their primitive construction. Inside the shelters, aliens from a dozen species sat together around human-made fires, eating human-cooked food and experiencing something that their advanced civilizations had somehow lost in their rush toward technological perfection: the simple, fundamental comfort of being cared for by people who knew how to survive. The Quirathi officials were composing reports, but their prose had shifted from critical to analytical, to something approaching admiration. The Venturians had stopped complaining about protocol violations and started asking questions about shelter construction techniques. The Thessians were actually talking to each other without filtered communication systems, discovering that direct interaction was unsettling but oddly satisfying. Tanaka sat down next to Velkoth, who was studying the fire with intense concentration. "You're going to file a report about this, aren't you? Comprehensive documentation is required for all significant events," Velkoth confirmed. "What are you going to say?" The Quirathi official was quiet for a moment, watching flames dance in patterns his species had never bothered to observe because they had always had better lighting. That humanity demonstrates remarkable adaptive capacity in suboptimal conditions. That your species maintains practical knowledge of primitive survival techniques despite technological advancement. That this represents either impressive foresight or concerning regression, analysis pending. "That's very diplomatic," Tanaka said. However, Velkoth continued, "I will also note that when comprehensive technological systems experienced cascading failure, human intervention prevented significant discomfort and potential injury to multiple galactic citizens, and that your food preparation techniques, while alarmingly direct, produce superior results to molecular reconstruction in certain applications. That might be the nicest thing anyone said about humanity since we joined the galactic community. Do not read excessive meaning into official documentation," Velkoth said, but his membranes rippled in what might have been amusement. The night stretched on. The storm gradually weakened, its fury spent. The humans kept the fires burning, maintained the shelters, ensured everyone remained comfortable with the quiet competence of people doing exactly what they were good at. Stories were shared across species barriers, cultural exchanges happened organically around the warmth, and somewhere in the process, a few dozen aliens began reconsidering their assumptions about the primitive newcomers from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. By morning, the rain had stopped. The resort's emergency systems finally came online, and management arrived with rescue teams, medical personnel, and prepared statements about unforeseen meteorological anomalies. They found their guests dry, fed, and sitting around smoldering campfires under palm frond shelters, looking like refugees from a disaster that everyone else seemed to have survived remarkably well. The resort director, a Prelian whose administrative credentials covered 3 data tablets, stared at the scene with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was undergoing hostile revision. "What happened here?" "It rained," Reyes said simply. "We dealt with it." "You built structures from organic matter." "Yes." "You created uncontained combustion events." "Campfires, yes." "You prepared food using direct thermal application." "That's generally how cooking works." The director's primary thought organ throbbed visibly. "This is highly irregular. This is highly effective." Velkoth interrupted, stepping forward with his tablet full of documentation. "I have comprehensive records indicating that human intervention prevented significant harm and provided material comfort when all technological systems failed." "A commendation," the director repeated, his voice flat, "for exemplary conduct during crisis conditions. It is all properly documented." The director looked at the shelters, the fires, the well-fed and surprisingly content aliens, and the 5 humans who were calmly dismantling their campsite with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Something in his administrative brain recognized that arguing with success was a losing proposition. "Very well," he said. "Incident report accepted. Commendations noted. We will be implementing upgraded atmospheric processing systems immediately. Might also want to keep some palm fronds and basic fire-starting equipment on hand," Chen suggested. "You know, just in case." The director's expression suggested this recommendation would be filed under concerning human proposals requiring extensive committee review, which meant it would never happen, which meant in approximately 18 months, when the upgraded systems also failed, everyone would be back in the same situation, wondering why they hadn't listened to the primitives. But that was a problem for future administrators. The aliens dispersed, returning to their various accommodations, many of them carrying small souvenirs from their unexpected adventure, a piece of charred wood from the fire, a section of woven palm frond, a new understanding that advancement wasn't the same as capability. The Korathi delegation filed 17 different reports, all of which would circulate through galactic bureaucracy for years, gradually shifting official perspectives on human utility by microscopic degrees. The Venturians updated their cultural databases. The Thessians reduced their sensory filtering by an average of 4%, which for their species represented revolutionary change. The humans packed their gear, extinguished their fires properly because they weren't monsters, and prepared to return to their regularly scheduled vacation activities, which would probably involve significantly less survival training than the previous evening. "Think we changed any minds?" Matsuda asked, watching the resort return to its carefully controlled artificial perfection. "Maybe a few," Okonkwo said. "Or maybe they'll just file us under useful primitives and forget about it until the next crisis. Either way, at least nobody died from being rained on," Chen said. "Setting the bar remarkably low there," Tanaka observed. "And yet we're the only ones who cleared it," Reyes pointed out. They walked back toward their accommodation, leaving behind empty fire pits and shelters that would probably be dismantled by maintenance crews within the hour, all evidence of human practicality erased in favor of returning to comfortable, fragile normalcy. The resort would upgrade its systems, file its reports, and continue operating exactly as it had before, confident that technology would prevent future disasters right up until it inevitably didn't. But somewhere in the galactic datasphere, in the official records and personal logs and cultural databases, a small note had been added to humanity's file, Dangerous, yes, primitive in many ways, certainly. But when the sophisticated systems failed, and the rain came down, and everyone else was drowning in 8 centimeters of water, and their own inadequacy, the humans built roofs from plant matter, lit fires that warmed more than bodies, and shared food that tasted like competence. Which was exactly the kind of reputation that would either get humanity respected or feared. And honestly, the humans were fine with either outcome. They had weathered worse storms than rain, both literal and metaphorical, and if the galaxy wanted to learn from that experience, excellent. If not, well, they would be around with palm fronds and fire when the next inevitable crisis arrived, because some species built monuments to their superiority, while others simply built things that worked. The resort sparkled in the morning sun, clean and controlled and utterly unchanged by the previous night's chaos, which really said everything about the galaxy's priorities and absolutely nothing about its wisdom. But the humans had learned long ago that you couldn't force enlightenment on people who preferred comfortable ignorance. You could only be there with practical solutions when reality inevitably reminded everyone that nature didn't care about technological advancement, administrative protocols, or the collective pride of 1,000 civilizations, and really when the universe decided to rain on everyone's parade, being the species that knew how to build an umbrella from scratch was a pretty good position to hold.